Great. Well, hello, everyone. Even though it was off to a rocky start, I am so glad to be here and so honored to have the opportunity to volunteer my time to your group. Meeting with Holly and everything that she had to share about your group sounds like it is such a needed service. Especially I've lived this personally, but I feel like young people, we often fall through the cracks when it comes to the realities of struggling with chronic conditions, including autoimmunity. So my intention today is to hopefully, first of all, validate your experience, but then also share information that will hopefully shed some light on what can be done, what can really be done when it comes to natural approaches for autoimmune conditions. So as Holly shared, I will be, I come to these talks obviously with an agenda, but with that said, you all might too, and there may be things that you are hoping to learn today. If that's the case, if you want to go ahead and plug that into the chat, or, I'm also a very participatory speaker, so feel free to wave a hand or just speak up and let me know as we're going along. If you need more clarification, if you want me to back up, if there's anything that you want to make sure I cover today. And we'll make this as engaging and meaningful as possible. Okay, so my name is Kimsey Self. I have, from a professional perspective, I have a Master of Arts degree in natural medicine. I'm certified in holistic nutrition. And for the last 5 years, I've owned my own business called Progressive Health and Wellness, which is a completely virtual company where we really specialize in working with people struggling with everything from digestive and mental health to fibromyalgia, autoimmunity, and everything in between. And we strive to uncover the different root causes that are driving those issues so that we can implement personalized recommendations to get lasting results. However, I started off as a patient. So back in 2005, I was in college, and needless to say, my diet, my lifestyle wasn't the best at this time. But nonetheless, it started off with really difficult digestive issues, acid reflux to the point that I formed polyps on my larynx. I lost my voice for 4 months, the bloating, constipation. I tested it one time to see how long I would go without having a bowel movement, without taking a laxative. And it was a week before I got so miserable. So I started back in college. Fast forward, I found the path to nutrition, changed my diet, and a lot of those things started to improve. I went through college, I graduated, landed my dream job working for a functional medicine doctor's office. And at that same time, I moved into a new house. And that's when everything spiraled. And for seemingly out of nowhere, everything started to come back. So the digestive issues came back, and I mean with a vengeance. The fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, insomnia. I gained 20 pounds in less than a year. And this was weighing on me extra hard because I felt like I had the tools, right? I felt like I had the resources. And I tried different diets, and I tried different supplements, and I tried a variety of things before finally realizing it wasn't working. And I really had to treat myself like the clients I was working with at that time. I had to get methodical, and I had to get diligent about really figuring out what was going on instead of just kind of playing the guessing game and trying things essentially willy-nilly. So at that point is when I started running functional lab testing. Long story short, discovered that it was mold. So I moved into a house that had higher levels of toxic mold and radon. When I figured that out, I broke the lease early, moved out, and started down the path of taking my health back. And so knowing what it's like to feel like you're dismissed by doctors, to feel like nobody really understands when I was following, very specific diet, or wondering why I'm taking all different kinds of supplements, feeling essentially dismissed, but at the same time, deep down, knowing there's got to be a better way and trusting in that process. That's what matters the most. So now I believe that our health shouldn't hold us back from being the person that we want to be. Oftentimes, when I ask people, and when I've given a variation of this talk before, I'll ask the audience, what does health mean to you? Right? When you hear the word health, what does it mean to you? And people will start chiming in, and if you want to chime in now, please feel free to chime in. But I'll often hear answers like weight loss, or dieting, or calories, or food, or stress management, fitness. But really, what health means is so much deeper than that. And I think everyone that has felt like it's been taken away from them can relate to this. Health means making memories with your loved ones. It means starting a family, or playing with your kids, or playing with your nieces and nephews, or your pets. It means crushing it in career or educational goals, rather than having to navigate doctor's appointments and medication schedules and essentially feeling like you're just getting by each day. So today, I'm going to take you through the process that we essentially take our clients through. And I've termed it root to rise. It's about getting to the root cause, but really getting to the root cause so that you can rise above it. And this process is, I like to look at it as a funnel. So we'll start off by talking about what the science shows are some of the most common contributing factors driving or perpetuating autoimmune conditions environmentally. We'll then talk about ways to start the process, right? So things that you can start to do on your own at home to start to, see how these things might affect your health. And then we'll look at some ways to personalize the process. We'll talk about different lab results, functional lab testing. I'll share client stories. And then towards the end, we'll talk about what it means to ultimately become your own doctor. So the process in a nutshell, from a high level, again, if we think of it like a funnel, the first step is to work to uncover the root cause. And I almost feel silly saying that because it's such a cliche statement in this world these days. First of all, very rarely is it one root cause. As you'll see in a minute, usually it's a complex of many different things that are all manifesting together to essentially overfill our inflammatory bucket. But the way that we do that is by assessing patterns, by combining your history, your personal history, your symptoms, your childhood experiences, your health history, your parents' health history, with the raw numbers and data from lab results. So I'll give you some examples of what this looks like. And we'll talk about, like I said, what the latest research is showing. Then we move into implementing the personalized plan. So this is based on your unique needs, nutrition, lifestyle, supplements, medication, mind-body work. And then finally, the ultimate goal is to reset the standard on what you expect out of your health, and form a very close relationship with your body so that you intuitively can pick up on when something is starting to deviate, when something is starting to go left of center, and know the steps to take in order to get your health back on track. So to start off, I thought this was an easy way to, when talking about the quote root causes, autoimmune disease is the manifestation of genetics interacting with environment. So what that means, and I'm assuming everyone here knows the definition of an autoimmune condition, and that is where the immune system attacks healthy tissue. So the prerequisite for that happening is a combination of a genetic predisposition or genetic susceptibility combined with environment pulling the trigger. So this is referred to as epigenetics. And epigenetics means that our destiny is not set in our genes. It is set in how the environment interacts with our genes. Because the environment, if the genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And that's what allows for the expression of certain genes to express autoimmunity. So this acronym I heard one time and really loved, I feel like makes it easy to remember what these environmental triggers consist of. So the acronym is FIGHTS. And we've got food, infection, gut health, hormones, toxins, like environmental toxins, heavy metals, chemicals, molds, for example, and stress. Stress meaning the day-to-day stress, like juggling career and traffic and family demands, along with more insidious and life-altering stressors, like experiencing childhood trauma or going through something like losing a loved one or loneliness or lacking meaning and purpose in life. So I mentioned that rarely is it one cause, right? One root cause. It's usually a combination of things. And what happens is as those different types of stressors, those environmental triggers accumulate, our bucket overflows. So what I mean by that is there's 3 different types of stress. I say stress, injury, the definition. So inflammation is a very commonly used term, but it's often difficult to define. And inflammation is often touted as being the root of all chronic disease, right? I think it was like 1999, the cover of Time magazine showed exactly that, inflammation, the root of chronic disease. But that's only part of the story, because inflammation is simply the body's response. It's how we heal ourselves. The real root is the injury. So to define inflammation, it is the immune system's response to injury. Now, I'm going to use the term stress and injury interchangeably. So immune response to injury, we know that there's 3 different categories of injury or stress. The first category is physical stress. So this would be any kind of damage to the physical body, right? Broken bones, sprained ankles, surgery, pregnancy, labor, traumatic brain injury. Those would be some examples. Second category is chemical stress. These would include things like the environmental toxins, food sensitivities, imbalances within the microbiome or gut health, infection, hormonal imbalance. And the third category is emotional stress, which I was describing before, both the day in, day out stressors, as well as more of the life-altering and insidious stressors. So if you think of the inflammatory cascade like a bucket, if you keep dumping water into a bucket, eventually it overflows. And the same concept applies here as I was just describing. As you keep layering injury upon injury, eventually a threshold is passed. And that is where genetics come into the picture. Genetics determine how big your bucket is and what manifests when it's overflowing. So inflammation at the end of the day is not a bad thing. It's how we heal ourselves. It only becomes a problem when the level of injury supersedes the body's ability to resolve it. So my job at the end of the day is to help my clients identify what their sources of injury are and systematically prioritize and eliminate them so the body can go back to healing itself. So to do that, I'm going today to talk about, I wish we could go through all of those environmental triggers, but I'm today going to talk about the two that will drain our bucket the biggest. These are the foundational steps that we take with each person. Even though the process, the details look different, these are foundational in order to allow us to go deeper. So before I move on, how we doing? I'm going to check in with everyone. Does anyone have questions? Is this resonating yet? Making any sense? Am I talking too fast? Okay, cool. Thank you, Caitlin, for the thumbs up. Thanks, Ollie, for the thumbs up. Okay, great. All right, I'll keep cruising along. So let's talk about the digestive tract, because you can't really have a conversation about autoimmune disease without talking about gut health. So I'm going to take us down a trip down the digestive tract. The intestines. The intestines are basically one long skin tube that runs all the way from one end down to the other. And it's the closest that the outside world comes in contact with our inside world. Quite literally, it's a cell wall division from the inside of the intestinal tract to the rest of the body. So naturally, if we're going to be invaded by a pathogen, by a toxin, it's pretty good likelihood that it's going to be in something that we're eating. So we're designed, we have 70 to 80% of our immune system residing in the intestinal tract. The intestinal barrier itself, the physical barrier, that one cell division that divides the gut from the rest of the body, is called a barrier system and is considered part of the immune system as well. So we have the epithelial lining, and I'm getting this nitty gritty because you're going to see that word come up in a few minutes. But we have what's called the epithelial lining, which is the type of cell that lines the gut. And then we've got the mucosal layer, which is that mucous membrane, sticky layer that's loaded with immune cells to help add an additional layer of protection. And then we also have what are called Peyer's patches and the gut-associated lymphoid tissue and all these different types of immune cells all lining the intestinal tract. And that's because the intestinal barrier is supposed to be like a fortress. Nothing can get through the gut lining unless it is escorted or absorbed. Now, we also have bacteria. We actually have a whole city of organisms living in, especially the colon. They're all over our body, but especially the colon, where we'll find 2 to 5 pounds of bacteria. Imagine that. Quite literally, they outnumber us. There's more bacterial DNA than there is human DNA. So I had a professor raise the question, it really begs the question, who's hosting who here? But these bacteria and the commensal, which means normal parasites, fungus, viruses, they all live symbiotically. And they're so important to our health from an immune system perspective, hormones, neurochemicals, metabolism, that researchers are starting to refer to this microbiome as another organ system. So last thing I want to mention about the digestive tract. So I mentioned the intestinal lining, supposed to be like a fortress. Through a combination of factors that we'll see in a couple of slides, the integrity of the intestinal lining can become degraded. and it can become more permeable or leaky. And quite literally what's happening is there's enzymes called zonulin. They're called tight junctions where the two cells, as you can kind of see in this image here, where the cells meet are called tight junctions. And they're held together by an enzyme called zonulin. And through emotional stress, physical stress, chemical stress, right? All those things that I was just talking about, it can allow the zonulin to be what's called upregulated, which allows the intestinal lining to become more permeable. We learned this by studying cholera, interestingly. So cholera initiates or it upregulates zonulin, and it induces that leaky gut syndrome. At this point, we're very well aware of this mechanism. There's even medications that are trying to be developed to induce leaky gut syndrome, hoping that it will help with absorption of the medication. I'm not going to comment on that. Point being, we know the mechanism and how it works very well. So leaky gut syndrome gets, I'm sure several of you, if not all of you, have heard that term these days, gets a lot of attention. And one thing I really want to put out there, because I feel like I'm at least always hearing practitioners say, heal the gut, heal the gut, heal the gut. And I agree with that, but I don't agree with this concept of, take some glutamine and heal your leaky gut. Leaky gut is transitory. It's a response to the environment. We have to clean up the environment before we can really heal the gut. So that's what we're about to talk about. So we'll talk about first the microbiome. So I'm going to read this quote. It's a powerful quote from Frontiers in Immunology 2 years ago. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to translate it. So this says, microbial adhesion to the epithelium could initiate a sequence of inflammatory responses by activating signal transduction via TLR's toll-like receptors and zonulin signaling, leading to the loss of tight junction integrity. So what this is saying is essentially what I just described. Microbial, so microbiome, opportunistic and infectious microbes in particular, can bind and adhere to that gut wall. And this initiates an immune response. The immune system comes in, says that's not supposed to be happening. We got to destroy that. So it uses chemicals called cytokines to destroy that, try to get rid of the bugs and the adhesion. But the intestinal barrier gets caught in the crossfire. And so when this happens repeatedly, that will start to lead to the loss of that tight junction integrity. Zonulin's upregulated, gut becomes permeable. So it says such chronic barrier dysfunction causes bacterial translocation and an inflammatory response that further damages the tight junctions and also induce epithelium apoptosis and inflammatory cytokines. So what this is saying is when this is happening over a long period of time, it can lead to changes within the microbiome and bacteria translocating, crossing across the gut barrier systemically. Blood is not sterile. This is not sepsis. This is a different scenario. But we know that bacteria can go from the gut to rest of the body. We'll see bacteria in the synovial tissue in joints, for example, in RA patients. So the immune response then causes barrier cell death, epithelium cell death by those cytokines. Now, this vicious cycle potentiates the autoimmune response in genetically susceptible patients and may trigger an acquired autoimmune response, even in genetically normal individuals. Now, we got a question. So somebody's asking, you said that there's a drug being developed to induce leaky gut to help move medications. Are they also developing a reverse Uno card for that. Like maybe one that could be repurposed for those of us with immuno or inflammatory diseases. Yeah, great question. So let me know. I'm going to recite that to make sure that I understand it. Excuse me, but you're asking, are they also developing a gut to help heal the gut lining for people that have autoimmune or chronic issues? And if that's what you're asking, I honestly don't know. I don't know if that's in development or not. With all of the attention that is being put on the digestive tract right now and the microbiome and the gut lining, I wouldn't be surprised. But I would have to look into that to see if that's actually in the works or not. But yeah, great question. If I hear of something, I'd be happy to pass that along. All right. By the way, guys, I'm not sure if Holly shared, but I'm 8 months pregnant right now, and talking makes me winded. So if you see me like suddenly take a deep breath, just know that that's what's going on. Okay, so cool. We're doing well on time. All right. So for my visual learners out there, here's a visual of what's happening with intestinal permeability and autoimmunity. So we have on the left symbiosis, and this represents a normal, healthy gut ecosystem. These yellow kind of Simpson looking hair things look like these are epithelial cells. So these are the cells that line the gut. These black two parallel lines right there. Are you guys able to see my cursor? Okay, great. All right. So the two parallel lines right there, that's zonulin. Those are the tight junctions. And here, this is the intestinal milieu. So we have immune cells and bacterial byproducts. And then we also have, thank you, Holly. We also have the other side of the intestinal. So in the blood itself, past the intestinal wall, we have immune cells scattered around here. So these are dendritic cells and T cells and macrophages and different types of immune cells. Okay, so genetic factors, as you can see, combined with environment, like we learned before, when these two things align, and we'll see in a minute what those environmental factors are, some of them, this starts to lead to imbalances within the microbiome. And we call this dysbiosis. So to give you an idea, if you think of the microbiome like a city, in a healthy, thriving city, we have just the right amount of people. We don't have too many because then we get traffic and congestion. And we don't have too little because then we might, certain roles might go unmet, certain needs might go unmet. We also ideally want a lot of different kinds of people. We want doctors and lawyers and janitors and mechanics and teachers, so that way the whole city is supported. If we have a city that's all doctors and lawyers and too many of them, we have a problem, right? Who's going to feed our kids, or who's going to teach our kids? Who's going to clean our buildings or fix our cars? But the other part of a city is, no matter how hard we try, there's always criminals, right? We'll always have criminals in a city. So we rely on the good citizens and the police force to keep these criminals in check. So in this example, we have, and what we're seeing with the dysbiosis is this refers to the criminals taking over the city. Criminals are called opportunists, or as you can see here, pathobions. These are normal bacteria. They're normal to have. They're not infectious. But they become problematic when they overgrow and they start to crowd out our good citizens in the police force. And then they start lighting fires and they start looting our buildings. And so that's what's happening here. Dysbiosis is that functional state where that overgrowth is starting to take place. There's less good bacteria, there's more opportunistics, and that triggers the immune system, our police force. They start sending out chemical warnings using cytokines. So as we see here, cytokines are the chemicals that immune cells use to both fight off invaders, pathogens, as well as attract more immune cells to the scene. We just learned about how that will degrade the intestinal lining and good bacteria get caught in the crossfire. So over time, it's like a war being fought in a city, right? Buildings are falling down, the city's on fire, the good citizens have fled, they cannot be found anywhere. And terrorist organizations, which would be infections in this case, the pathobionts, they're taking over. The gut lining has been considerably degraded. So now we're seeing leaky gut syndrome. We're seeing malabsorption. So as you can see on the image on the left, the kind of finger-like projections are called villi and microvilli. That's how we absorb nutrients. But when this inflammation is going on, they go from shag carpet to Berber. This is quite literally what happens with celiac disease, but we can see it on a functional level even without celiac. So malabsorption happens. Now, to connect the dots of how you get from there to autoimmune, when there's intestinal permeability and you've got bacterial endotoxins like lipopolysaccharides and TMAO and whole bacteria, as well as just toxins that we eat in our food or undigested food proteins leaking into the rest of the body. Immune cells, this is one mechanism of autoimmunity, but immune cells will attach to that like ants to a piece of sugar. This creates something called a circulating immune complex. So this is circulating around in the blood and it gets lodged in various tissue. Let's say the joints. Another branch of the immune system comes in and says, hey, that's not normal. That's not supposed to be there. This thing is also emitting a bunch of signals saying, hey, help us. We're in distress. Help us fight this battle. Immune system comes in, uses chemicals, cytokines to destroy that. Innocent tissue gets caught in the crossfire. And as that tissue, the tissue that's caught in the crossfire, proteins are released and the immune system will start to go after that. And before you know it, that's what starts to initiate the autoreceptivity. So the autoantigenic response, where the immune system sees that and starts going after healthy tissue, makes the memory, and now it thinks that healthy tissue is part of the invasion. Another kind of sister response to that is called molecular mimicry. And that's where something like, we'll take gluten, because I'm going to talk about gluten in a minute. The gluten protein, seeps through the gut lining again. Well, the gluten protein looks a lot like, let's say, the thyroid, right? Thyroid peroxidase enzyme, or thyroglobulin, or it could be the synovial tissue and joints. The proteins, they look a lot alike. So when the immune system goes after gluten, it mistakes the healthy tissue for gluten. Now, if you could see my hands close enough, you'll see that my rings are on two different fingers. They're not the same, but from a molecular, what the segment of protein that the immune system is reading, it's close enough to the same. It's like looking at the words read and read, right? Same word, different meaning. And that will perpetuate. Once those immune cells have that memory, we've got autoimmunity. Okay, so I just covered a lot of information. Let me know if any of that got confusing, if any questions came up, but that really starts to highlight the importance of the health of the gut, the microbiome, the immune system. Another thing I wanted to share too is probiotics. The advancement in research in probiotics that we've gotten over the past 10 years is huge. And the microbiome in general. And when I was in school 10 years ago, they recommended, like, everybody got probiotics. They were great. The broader the spectrum, the better. But we now appreciate strain selectivity and the role that probiotics supplementally really play in gut health. They're important. They're a huge component. But going back to our tourist analogy, to our city analogy, probiotics are like tourists. They come in, they spend their money, and they leave. And especially if our city is, was there a question? No, we're good. Okay. So especially if our city is being run over by criminals and is on fire, they're not going to stay very long, right? So what we need to do is to get rid of the criminals and get rid of any terrorist organizations first, and then put out the fires and start to build parks, start to build schools, and turn the intestinal terrain into a place that's hospitable for probiotics. And then get the right strains that have been shown. They're actually house hunting, right? They're traveling because they want to move. That's what we're looking for. And then they'll set up residence and can start to change the intestinal milieu. All right. So environmental factors affecting the gut microbiome and leaky gut. There's several. This is a snippet. These are some of the more common ones. Chronic stress. So chronic stress, chronic emotional stress in this case, again, like always being in a hurry, working long hours, burning the candle at both ends, not sleeping enough. This study quoted here is actually they were looking at athletes and the physical stress and emotional stress that they were going through and how that upregulated zonulin. So chronic stress. Diet. So the standard American diet, high fat, high sugar, processed foods laden with glyphosate and other herbicides and all these different, void of nutrients. Certain medications. This one, I read something interestingly when I was putting together this study, was talking about antacids. And now I'm going to give out the disclaimer. All of this advice tonight does not replace that of your doctors. This is not medical advice. This is simply education. So please do not stop taking any medications based on this or trying things based on this alone. But what I was reading is that antacids, because they suppress stomach acid, I want to say it was a type of I don't remember the exact bacteria, but it's one that's part of the oral microbiome. Pseudomonas, maybe? Oral microbiome, we would swallow it and normally it would be killed in stomach acid. But with the suppression of stomach acid, it allowed it to actually translocate into the intestines where it was associated with that epithelial adhesion and leaky gut and autoimmunity. So it was pretty interesting. But nonetheless, certain medications, we'll often hear about antibiotics, for example. Traumatic brain injury, pretty big, actually. So this study showed that because of the gut-brain connection, in particular the vagus nerve, but there's many ways that the gut and brain are connected. Traumatic brain injury and the inflammation that it creates actually induced leaky gut syndrome within 30 minutes of the injury. So that was pretty significant. And then infections of all types, parasitic, bacterial, viral, fungal. I think the study is on COVID actually, and how it is associated with leaky gut and autoimmunity. So here is for, if any of you are nerds like me and like reading the research, I just took snippets of the abstract and the notes. I linked to all of these studies so that way you can see what some of the more recent research is showing. Okay, so I want to give kind of a case study and talk about Carla's story briefly. Carla she's a client of mine. She is 54 years old, diagnosed with RA. She also had loose stools, fullness, reflux, along with the classic RA symptoms of joint swelling, pain, and stiffness. Her labs when we got started showed active inflammation, high blood sugar, low iron trending towards anemia. And the stool test, her results are over on the right. And you can see at the top, she had an infection, a C. diff infection. And that's what was contributing to the loose stools and the GI pain. So we started off with her by changing her diet and starting an autoimmune paleo protocol, which I share some of the details later in this, and then really addressing using different kinds of antimicrobials to address the C. diff and the GI inflammation. And within about 3 months, oh wait, someone can't see my screen. Can everybody else see my screen?
Actually, I got it now. Sorry.
Ah, cool. Okay, great. Within about 3 months, she had stopped all of her medication before we got started, but she was having more mobilization. Her joint pain had decreased, the swelling had decreased, and she was playing with her granddaughters more often and could actually lift them up for the first time in several years. So there's a lot of power in working with the gut. And food. So now we look at food triggers. And I want to check in with everyone. I know we got a 7-minute late start. Is everyone okay if I go to at least till 6 o'clock, if not 6:05 or so, and then open up for questions? Feel free to respond in the chat, but I'll try to be as timely as possible. So thank you everyone for giving that extra time. I appreciate it. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about gut inflammation, talked about how food proteins can cross through the gut barrier. When that happens, it invites an immune response. That is how food sensitivities and allergies are formed. And we talked about molecular mimicry, right? How food looks like our tissue, and that can perpetuate autoimmunity. What this means is food is one of our most powerful forms of medicine. Now, when we say medicine, I mean emphasizing the good, so emphasizing nutrient-dense, whole, minimally processed foods, and removing, I don't like the word bad, but I'm removing identified triggers. So tonight, I'm talking about gluten and dairy because they have a lot of research around them about how they're involved in several different autoimmune conditions. But I also there's a slide on here where I talk about using food as medicine and therapeutic diets. And I mentioned the paleo diet and the autoimmune paleo diet and the low FODMAP diet and the low histamine diet. And, the point being, there is no one size fits all plan. So with 95% of the clients I work with that have an autoimmune condition, I do pull them off of gluten and dairy. Soy and corn are really close contenders to that. But the reason being, let's start with gluten, is actually, before I say that, I also want to put in perspective the ultimate goal here. And the ultimate goal is using food as medicine in the sense that we start off by identifying and removing known food triggers while we optimize the gut environment. Beyond that, while we optimize overall health, meaning if there are other factors like mold toxins or heavy metals or infection, right, we keep going deeper to address those things. Ultimate goal being to reintroduce foods back in and get to where you enjoy a sustainable diet, whatever that looks like for you. A lot of people don't want to touch gluten again because they feel so good it's not worth it, right? A lot of that's mind-body connection too. Some people can bring it back in. So it really just depends on the person. But I'm not trying to get up here and say food is the enemy. You have to follow a restricted diet your entire life. That's not the goal. It's a tool. So gluten, though, does have some research around it. So gluten is made up of the glutenin and gliadin protein. And I say that because you'll probably see gliadin around here in this presentation a lot. But it's been shown that gluten, let me come back to that. Here we go. Actually upregulates zonulin in all people, not just those that are gluten sensitive. So in some people, their immune system launches after gluten too, and there's an immune inflammatory response. In all people, the gluten of modern times upregulates zonulin and induces intestinal permeability. Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind with that. I said gluten of modern times. One, there's evidence suggesting that the real problem is glyphosate. And glyphosate is an herbicide. It's found in like Roundup, produced by Monsanto. I feel like they changed their name, but anyways, one of the most pervasive types of herbicides, sprayed on wheat and other gluten-containing products, along with corn and soy. But there's arguments saying that that's why some people can tolerate gluten in Europe, particularly European countries that have banned glyphosate. Some have, not all have. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is there's evidence suggesting that imbalances in the microbiome is actually what affects the ability to digest gluten. And so if there's those imbalances, then the gluten can have the opportunity to upregulate zonulin. Nonetheless, eliminating gluten for a period of time can be a very powerful first step for some people. Not only because of this, but the other reason being is the way that gut bacteria interact with gluten. It creates opioid-like compounds called gluteomorphins that bind to our brain and make it physiologically addictive. So I have a slide here about how this isn't our grandmother's wheat. Oftentimes people say we've been eating wheat for thousands of years, and we really haven't been, and it's not this wheat. So it's been hybridized and deamidated, so treated to the point that the proteins change, not to mention then we have the glyphosate issue. So it's different, and that's why it can be more immunoreactive. I have a study in here talking about that with non-celiac disease. And then dairy. I would say, if anybody asked me what are the two biggest food triggers with autoimmunity, most commonly, I would venture to say gluten and dairy. Now, keeping in mind, again, everyone's different. And so some people make these changes, they cut out gluten and dairy and don't see a difference. There's a lot more involved with that. But I bring up dairy because a few different reasons. One, the beta A1 casein. So there's A1 and A2. A2 tends to be more immunotolerant than A1, higher in goat's milk. A1 is more immunoreactive, higher in cow's milk. Nonetheless, it is molecularly similar to gluten, but has been shown to also not only cross-react with gluten, but it can also upregulate zonulin and is connected. There's literature connecting it to multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, celiac disease, type 1 diabetes, to name a few. And those are the ones that just have research based on when I was preparing for this. The other thing to keep in mind with dairy is kind of similar to the gluten conversation. A lot of the dairy that many conventional dairy, we'll say that's like readily available in grocery stores, is not the dairy that we would have been eating traditionally, right? It's pasteurized, which changes the protein sequence. Immune system always goes after proteins. So remember that the immune system always goes after proteins. And proteins, if we're changing them around, it's like changing the letters in the alphabet to make different words. So changing proteins kind of turns it into a different structure that the immune system may not recognize, which happens with pasteurization. And then then there's also cows are fed antibiotics and hormones and different medications. So there's other contaminants that could be potentially getting into the dairy as well that can disrupt the gut microbiome. And then like gluten, gut bacteria can metabolize casein, one of the primary proteins in dairy, into what's called caseomorphin, which is, again, it binds to those opiate receptors in the brain, making it physiologically addictive, but then also kind of modulating pain. Now, we can take that conversation one step further when looking at testing for food sensitivities. And that's what we did in Sarah's case. She, 50-year-old woman diagnosed with Hashimoto's and fibromyalgia. She had cut out gluten and reduced sugar, but was still having flares pretty consistently. So I recommended the autoimmune paleo diet with her, and I'll share those details in a minute. She made really great strides there. And then eventually the goal was to personalize it more. So we tested for food sensitivities using the LEAP MRT test, which are the snapshots that you see on the screen. And that's what allowed us to, reintroduce some of the AIP foods and be more specific with the foods that were being avoided. But as you can see, part of the reason she responded so well to AIP is grains were not really her friend overall. And then there were some other individuals like ginger being off the charts. Okay, so solutions. The process is very systematic, meaning I use that funnel analogy again, where we start with laying the foundation. And I encourage anybody that's trying to navigate this on your own too, or maybe if you're working with a practitioner or a doctor, to be methodical about it. And the body can only handle so much at once. And this is really where the art of healing comes in. So we start with laying the foundation, anti-inflammatory nutrition plan, stress, mind-body work, nervous system retraining, sleep, and then move methodically deeper as we get data from lab tests and the person's body starts to become stronger. So that next step is that gut-focused process. We'll often look at a stool test, and I'll show you some snapshots here of stool results, but we'll look at a stool test and see, what does the microbiome look like? Are those criminals taking over? Is there inflammation? Is there infection? How are they digesting food? And then develop a plan to address that so that by those first couple months, the person's foundation, once we've got food working for us and the gut working for us, now we're able to start to go deeper and look at things like mold or heavy metals or other infections before ultimately moving into maintenance. So got a question here from Amy for the dairy issue. Is butter a little safer or cleaner to try reintroducing versus milk and cheese? Yeah, great question. So if you've been avoiding dairy and all dairy, then butter would be a better option to start the reintroduction process with. Yeah, I would suggest that. Some of my clients will ask when I say no dairy, and I'm talking about the proteins and blah, 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 if butter is okay. And there's still a small amount of protein in butter and even in ghee. So ghee, the intention is to remove the proteins, but we don't have the chemical capacity to remove them completely. So I advise removing both during the elimination phase, but then butter or ghee would be a great thing to start with reintroducing. So yeah, great question. Okay, so nutrition. This is, as I've implied, it's so bio-individual, but I did want to write down some key things that are foundational for each person. So really emphasizing whole foods, minimally processed, as much organic as possible, go local when possible, really minimize or avoid fast and processed food. Not to say that everything that comes out of a box is bad by any means, but when you're starting to get into ingredients labels that are a mile long and you can't pronounce half of it, that's more of what I'm implying. And then here are a list of some of the more, I'll say, common therapeutic diets that we and our practice use with autoimmunity, depending on the person. So the paleo diet, which mimics the way our Paleolithic ancestors ate, eliminating grains, legumes, gluten, corn, soy, sugar, processed foods. The autoimmune paleo diet takes that one step further by encompassing lectins. That can be their protein starch combos that can be irritating to the gut lining and actually cross the gut barrier too. So here we take away nightshades, coffee, chocolate. There's the low FODMAP diet. If bacterial overgrowth of the small intestine is suspected or confirmed, this removes certain types of fermentable starches. And then there's the low histamine diet if the issue seems to be driven by mast cells or parasites or histamine intolerance. We'll see this actually fairly often with long COVID too, or chronic viral infections, where histamine is actually at play. So again, it really depends on the person, and just reiterating how these are really designed to be therapeutic diets. So we get in, we do the work, and then we eventually start to introduce foods back in, being the goal. Okay, so these next few slides will walk through an elimination diet, which is a great way to start. That's how we treat those diets that I just described. And I don't like the word diet, but it's a way of eating. So, I walk through, and I'm happy to send these slides over for you guys, so that Holly can blast them out. But walk through the different categories of foods to avoid, ideally for at least 3 weeks, and as completely as possible. Reducing from an immune system perspective is really kind of meaningless. So avoid them as much as possible. And then after 3 weeks, systematically introduce each food back in. And you can do this. This example is more of a kind of a paleo style elimination diet, but you could do it with high histamine foods or FODMAP foods, whatever's needed. And then reintroduce and monitor for symptoms. And if a symptom is identified, then you cut that food out again for a minimum of 3 months before attempting to reintroduce. So an elimination diet can be a great kind of helpful way for people to get started that they can try on their own. We often guide our clients through this with, oftentimes people get kind of confused about what to eat. But there are lots of really great resources out there too, books and things to help you through this also. But that can be a really helpful starting place. And then personalization through lab work. So labs are invaluable when it comes to getting specific. As the old adage goes, don't just guess, test, right? So if you have the ability, this can be a really great way to finally find answers and recommendations that are unique to you. Practitioners can order this. Some tests can be ordered direct to consumer online. There are resources called like direct labs, where you can get certain types of tests shipped directly to you if you then know how to review the results. So it can be really helpful. And then ultimately, the goal is for you to become your own doctor by having a deep understanding of what got you here in the first place and what's needed to keep feeling your best. So you really raise the bar on what you expect out of your health each day. And when you feel that start to slip, you know the right questions to ask and the right changes to make to help yourself get back on track so that you feel great most of the time. And that's what happened with Camille. Camille's very special to me because she started working with us. She'd been diagnosed with lupus. She started working with us when she was on disability. And her goal was to get off of disability and start working again. And when we met a couple months ago, she said that she wasn't renewing her disability and she's starting to look for jobs. And that's what this is about. That is ultimately what this is about. So I'll leave you with this popular Benjamin Franklin quote, and I know we have 2 questions, so I see you guys over there. The doctor of the future will give no medication, but will interest his patients in diet and the cause and prevention of disease. All right, everyone. Thank you for the extra time today. And again, for the understanding about the delayed start. I really, let me answer these questions first, and then please note, you all donated your time for me today, and I would love to give my time in return. So please feel free to, we've got a Facebook group that now has closer to 4,000 people in it. I go live in there every week. We give out menu plans, tips, tons of free information. And then if you're thinking, okay, I've had enough, I want to get to the bottom of this, I want answers and I want results, please feel free to schedule a free 15-minute discovery call. We'll see, talk more about some of the health challenges that you're experiencing and what you're looking for. And if it feels like a good fit for both of us, then we'll talk about what next steps look like from there. So as I answer these 2 questions, I'll go ahead and open it up. If anybody has any additional questions, chime in, let me know either in the chat or through audio. But let's see. So Anne is asking, how did you treat yourself for mold after you moved out in terms of binders and antifungals? Yeah, good question. So with mold, there's different types of mycotoxins. So mold produce what are called mycotoxins. And mycotoxins are chemical, noxious, toxic gases that we inhale from, most commonly or significantly, from a water damaged building. So testing for the mycotoxins is important because they have different effects and different binders are more effective than others depending on the type of mycotoxin. So testing for the mycotoxin is very helpful. We use Great Plains Labs to do that. It's a urinary test, super easy. There's 2 other labs too, Vibrant Wellness and Real Time Labs. They're all urine tests that test for mycotoxins. From there, the different kinds of binders or detox support. If tolerated, glutathione is really helpful because it was helpful for me. It helps mobilize the mycotoxins from the tissue so that they can be detoxified through the liver, bowels, or kidneys. And then certain types of binders will often use things like charcoal or diatomaceous earth, bentonite clay, chlorella, certain probiotics. So from there, we'll use the binders. And for anybody that doesn't know, mycotoxins that are detoxified through the gallbladder dump into the bowels, and they can actually be recirculated. So we end up reabsorbing them instead of eliminating them through, pooping. Binders bind them in the bowels so that you do eliminate them through bowel movements and prevent that reabsorption. So there's a few different binders that we'll use. And then with antifungals, it's a good question because mold and yeast are both part of the fungal family. And so they're like best buds, and mold can enhance the growth of yeast in the GI tract. Mold can actually inoculate body cavities like the sinus cavity, the lungs, the gut, and encourage the growth of yeast. And so antifungals, I took fluconazole at one point. Nystatin can be used. Those are prescriptive. So we don't prescribe, but in our case, we would recommend, visiting their doctor. There's herbal antifungals too, that are combinations of different types of herbs, different protocols that we'll use for that. Good question. That was the answer in a nutshell, if that helps. Okay, what is a good cost-effective food sensitivity lab test? That is a great question. So not all food sensitivity tests are created equal. The most common that's out there are antibody tests, IgG usually, sometimes IgA. IgE is an allergy test, so that would be a food allergy. So things like, what is that called? Everlywell, or some of the ones that you can get sent direct to your house. Those IgGs aren't very sensitive, meaning they'll often show false negatives and false positives. So the test that we use is called the mediator response test. And it's measuring, I talked about those cytokines. It's measuring the chemicals released by the white blood cells in response to a food antigen. And it's those chemicals that cause our symptoms. So we get a lot better results with it. As far as cost goes, direct to consumer, there usually has to be a practitioner that orders it for you. There may be sites out there where you can order it on your own. I want to say I saw that before, and it was like upwards of $600. So it was pretty pricey. In our practice, I think the test is around $350, $400, depending on the panel that we run. Trying to think, but that they may be on direct labs. It would be worth checking on direct labs if you're not trying to, work with a full practitioner. But, I share that also to say, I think there's, spend your money in a place where it's going to get you the best results. So that would be my recommendation there. Some people have run Everlywell, and they cut out the foods and it makes a difference too. So, there could be some benefit, but just kind of sharing that discrepancy. Okay, let's see here. I love this engagement, everyone. This is great. All right, what do you recommend for a chronic viral infection? Good question. So a couple ways to answer that. That really depends. So when we think of a chronic viral infection, viruses are by definition opportunistic. So what that means is virus hijacks your cells. Different viruses hijack different cells, but a virus hijacks your cells, and there's the initial infection, but then they go dormant. And they go dormant because the immune system gets a hold of it and keeps them suppressed. If there's something weakening the immune system, and they have the opportunity, that's what opportunist means, they have the opportunity to re-express, they can and often will. So when asking, what do we do for chronic viral infections? We go through especially those first two steps that I mentioned before, starting with food and optimizing the gut, especially the gut microbiome. And then oftentimes the immune system will be more intact and capable of suppressing the viral infection. We know, for example, though, that things like mold suppresses the immune system, so that would have to be dealt with. As far as things to do, there can be some helpful things. So like vitamin D, glutathione, lysine can all be helpful. But I wanted to kind of put it in context as far as if there's a chronic viral infection that's always re-expressing, we have to ask the question why. And so that's where we start to look at those other factors there. I didn't want to just be like, take the supplement, you know what I mean? So thinking about it more big picture oriented, but those things can help. Like I said, vitamin D, sometimes zinc, glutathione, and lysine. Okay, Caitlin's asking, can you have an allergist or MD order similar tests? If you're asking about food sensitivity tests, That would be, so an allergist will most commonly run an allergy test. That'll be either a skin prick or like a blood test IgE. Allergies are different from sensitivities. It's a different immune mechanism. Some allergists will run a sensitivity test, but I don't hear of that more often or all that often. As far as the MD ordering similar tests, so this is where we get a little complicated because MDs, if they're working through insurance, they're underneath the thumb of the insurance. So for example, the stool test that I showed you, we run the GI map stool test. You can Google that, see everything that it runs. GI map, it's looking at the functionality of the digestive tract, because we're looking for function and optimization. If a doctor orders a stool test through insurance, they can only run the markers that coincide with the symptoms that research has based that on. So if the person has constipation, they can't run oftentimes something like Giardia, because Giardia causes diarrhea, not constipation. So point being, to answer your question in kind of a long roundabout way, is they can help in running some tests, but not oftentimes the breadth of the tests that functional practitioners will run, not to the fault of their own. They're just kind of limited in their ability. But nonetheless, I mean, we'll often work with clients and, give a list of labs, particularly blood labs, that we'd like to see, take to their doctor and see if they can run it through insurance. If we can use that, then let's use it. But as far as like asking the doctor to run a stool test, we're just not going to get the same data. Okay, somebody's asking, how did you finally drop the 20 pounds gained from mold? Same thing happened. I'm sorry to hear that. If you're eating a low carb diet and doing fasting, but blood sugar is still high. So, so the low carb and the fasting are great. I've started doing that too. That really helped. Getting out of the house was a huge part of it, and thoroughly addressing the mold. I also had like a bunch of yeast issues in my gut. So addressing that became a big part of it. I would love to look at like specifics. So this is where we start to get into more like personalized approaches and looking at like thyroid and blood sugar patterns and inflammatory markers and things along those lines. But also asking the question, is fasting, but blood sugar is still high. So I do start to think about the mitochondria in that case. That's one thing. So if the energy factory kind of powerhouse of the cell is polluted from things like mold or hypothyroidism or something, it will affect the amount of glucose that the cell can actually tolerate. So it's almost like insulin resistance from the inside out rather than the outside in. Stress can also affect that too. So, there's kind of a spectrum of things, but that's where we start to get more personalized. Okay. And then lastly, it looks like the last question. If you're going to reintroduce grains, would you recommend local, organic, non-GMO, heritage grains to minimize glyphosate, and for wheat to be closer to wheat 4 times? For dairy, going with raw? Yeah, good question. So that would be great. Yeah, if you've been avoiding grains for a period of time, yeah, going with definitely the organic non-GMO, and then, ideally with no glyphosate, and then looking at things like even like white rice, where, we say not, you never want to eat anything white kind of thing, but white rice, it has actually, the lectins are split off of it. So white rice could be more tolerated. And then Like you said, as far as wheat goes, some people do have more success with like einkorn wheat is what it's called. EINKORN, which is one of those heritage forms of wheat. So yes, yeah, the short answer to that is I would do that. Same thing with dairy. I would start with goat products first, and then start to move into like goat cheese, goat milk, and then start to move into cow. If you can get raw local, that's awesome. And start introducing the raw local, and then look at things like butter and ghee and then cheese and kind of titrate up from there. Yeah, good questions. Yay, I love this. All right, everyone. So we are all set. I love the engagement. Thank you so much for all of the questions. I really hope to connect with each of you through the group. Stay in touch, let me know if any questions came up from today's talk that you thought of afterwards, or for anybody that couldn't attend live, please feel free to reach out to me either through the Facebook group or email with questions that come up. And again, if you guys are really, really ready to find answers and solutions, I invite you to schedule that discovery call and let's see how we can help. And Holly, huge shout out to you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really, really loved your group and getting to share this time with you all. Thank you.